first half. We're doing this 8-week seminar, the title of which is Death, Karma and Wisdom. So Death, Karma and Wisdom. And there's 3 of us doing that course, myself, Maitreya Bandhu, and Kusala Sara. And it's designed so that you can just drop in. So just raise your hand if you've been to any of the other sessions. Oh, lots of you have. That's really good. Okay, great. But the thing that I'm quite enjoying is that we're sort of making points and then picking them up from each other and exploring them in slightly different ways. And that's what I'm going to be doing a bit this evening. I'm going to particularly pick up on a couple of points that Maitreya Bandhu's made over the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to sort of pick those up and explore them from different angles. I want to go right back to the start of the seminar to begin with, where we started talking about death. And that's where I want to start. So we started talking about the mystery of death. I said right at the start, in the first week, that this is a particularly poignant time for me because I had a very significant loss quite early in my life, or relatively early anyway. So it's almost 20 years to the day since my father died. So he died 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years on July the 26th. And he is a very prominent figure in my mind and in my consciousness. And I've been thinking about him a lot recently because it's coming up to the 20th anniversary of his death. And around the anniversary of his death, I'm going to do a kind of a solitary retreat to mark the fact that it's been 20 years since his passing. And I'm going to just speak a little bit about him tonight. I mentioned a very significant dream that I had about him in the first week, where he appeared to me in a very, very clear, very sort of radiant form at a certain point. And I'm going to talk about a different dream that I had about him tonight. So we have this fact of death. We lose people that are close to us. We know that we're going to die. On some level, we know that we're going to die at some point. But we don't know when that's going to happen, and we don't know how it's going to happen. So that's a fact that is really... it's in a sense, it's overshadowing our lives. And the question is, how do we live in the face of that, really? How do we live? What do we do? How do we sort of... how do we exist in relationship to that fact? And we don't know what death means. This is what we've been saying all along, is we don't know what death means. But what I want to start to explore this evening is, and Maitreya Bandhu talked about this in the first half in a slightly different way, is I think what we do know is that life has value and life has meaning. So it's not that there is death and we don't know what it means and there's nothing. I think in a sense, exploring death, coming into relationship with death, can actually start to help us to uncover what is the meaning of life. So what does that mean for us that are here? And given the fact that we have this short span of life, what does that mean, and what are we going to do with it? And I think how we uncover and deepen that sense of meaning and sense of value can't be extricated from death. It can't be extricated from thinking about that. And well, I think I'll start. I'll sort of carry on by talking about this dream, actually. So I had this dream about my father. I was actually on solitary retreat when I had the dream. It was a couple of years ago, and so I was doing a retreat on my own, which is something that I really, really enjoy to do. And one of the things that I enjoy doing about it, or one of the things that I enjoy about it, is that I often seem to have quite significant dreams when I'm doing a solitary retreat. And I think part of that is that you're creating space, you're in very, very good conditions. But I think the other thing about it is that, well, I sort of think of it almost as like you're sort of creating a mythic space where something can arise, and your mind is clear enough that everything can start to take on a sort of a sheen, a sort of a sparkle, and your dreams are part of that. I think I've given talks at this class before where I was telling a story about being on, it was actually on the same solitary retreat that I had this dream. And I remember thinking, oh, this retreat's not really working, nothing's really happening. And then I was walking back one day from a walk back to the hut where I was staying, and I suddenly noticed that I'd sort of spent 5 minutes looking at the dewdrops on these leaves and sort of seeing them fall off, basically. And I thought, oh yeah, obviously nothing's happening with this retreat, you know. I'm sort of doughy-eyed, kind of looking at this leaf going, it's so beautiful. So something was happening. And on this retreat, I had this dream, and I couldn't immediately figure out what it meant. It was quite strange in some ways. But what it was basically I had this dream where I gave my father a gift. And the gift was a novelty-shaped bottle of butterscotch vodka. So I'd like you to get into pairs and discuss what you think that... No, I'm just joking. Although we will do that a bit later on, but you won't need to discuss the butterscotch vodka. So I gave my father this kind of... It was a bottle of vodka in the shape of something else. I can't even remember what it was. It was in the shape of a ship or a squirrel or something, and it was butterscotch vodka. So I thought, what does that mean? What does it mean? And I thought, okay, I'm not gonna work out what it means. I'm just going to bear it in mind. I'm just gonna like let it be there. And over the course of the rest of the retreat, it was about halfway through, and it was a 2-week solitary retreat. Over the course of the rest of the retreat, I worked out what it meant. It was like, in meditation, I had one of these like, that's what it was. And it was, I often get this with dreams. I don't know if you get this, but a linguistic aspect of a dream will start to unlock the meaning for me. I don't know if you have that, but suddenly the word that came into my mind was souvenir. What I was giving him was a souvenir. And the thing about souvenirs is they're really poor quality things, basically, generally, aren't they? I mean, you see like these shops in London. I don't know how they managed to make a business out of this, but they do. You know, they sell like little miniature Big Bens, and they've always got mugs out the front with Kate Middleton and, you know, for £1 and things like that. Like, that's a souvenir, isn't it? It's an object that doesn't really have any value. They're generally just gifts that you give to people, you know. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to call them, she used to talk about the shops where you get these things, she'd call them the crap shops. Because she lived in Brighton, and there's lots of those sorts of shops in Brighton. Like, they don't, you know, it's sort of like pink velvet Buddhas and things like that. You know, they're just things that they don't, they're poor quality objects. They don't have any intrinsic value, and you know they don't have any intrinsic value. So why you would buy something like that and give it to a friend? I mean, what does that say about your friendship? You know, it's like, I got you this thing that's like really horrible, and we both know it's really horrible, but anyway, there we are, it's the thought that counts. So it's an object that had no value, basically. And I was also giving him vodka, which is an intoxicant. Butterscotch vodka, still haven't quite worked that one out. But I was giving him something that had no value and an intoxicant. And in the dream, he was very displeased. So I remember he was very, very displeased with that. So I've had dreams where I've been with him and he's been very happy about things. And in this dream, he was quite displeased. And basically, so what my father represents to me in some ways is a sort of something like something to do with my potential. I had a very good relationship with my father. I have a very good relationship with my father, which sounds like a strange thing to say since he's been dead 20 years. But I do have a very good relationship with him. He's very important to me. And my relationship with him was pretty uncomplicated. So the way that I relate to him is quite straightforward. And one of the things that I really appreciate about him is that he was extremely reliable and straightforward and consistent. So many of the things that I appreciate about my father were, you know, if he said he was going to be somewhere, he would be somewhere. If he said he was going to do something, he would do something. He was consistent, he was reliable, all of those things. And in a sense, I aspire to be those things as well. And because I respect and admire him, I think in my consciousness he partly represents that potential. And so, in a way, in the dream, what I was doing was trying to give a gift to him, because I feel that he gave me many, many gifts in my life. He gave me many gifts. And I was trying to give him a gift, but it wasn't good enough, basically. And what I take away from that is, if you're going to honour your potential, you need to do it with something really beautiful and really meaningful. And if you're going to actually grow and live a meaningful life, then you are going to have to sort of do that in a way that creates beauty. You're going to have to do that in a way that creates something of genuine meaning and genuine value, and not just something that has the quality of a souvenir. And the other aspect of that dream is, it's around my behaviour. So vodka obviously is an intoxicant, and what I'm trying to do is to become the opposite of what an intoxicant does for you. So I'm trying to become more conscious, more aware, and what I was doing was giving something that in a way represented the opposite of that. So it was a kind of a salutary experience having that dream, and I think it was a very, very sort of useful reminder for me. And the reason why I'm talking about it today is because I think when I was thinking about what we've been discussing over the last few weeks, it's very, very poignant and very relevant in terms of, well, how do we live in relationship to this fact of death? And how do we live in relationship to that in terms of our potential? So, Maitreya Bandhu was talking about our actions in the first half. And we have to let that fact influence the way we behave. So we have to change ourselves in relationship to that. Maitreya Bandhu used this wonderful word last week, which I thought was fantastic, which he talked a lot about magnificence. So he talked about how do we live out that magnificence? How do we start to create that magnificence in our own lives? And the way that we do that is by changing our actions, by changing the things that we do. We need to create the conditions where that magnificence can arise. And I think in a sense that's, well, again, Maitreya Bandhu's talked a little bit about this, but in a sense that's a human thing that we do. What we're talking about is how we are as a human being, coming into relationship with all the different aspects of our humanity. So as Maitreya Bandhu mentioned, all that we can become, all the positives of that, and also taking ownership of all the negatives of that as well. But that's not a given. So that's not going to happen by itself. So I think it's important to think about this. When we talk about this, we start to talk about our potential, we start to talk about what can arise when we behave in a positive way. So when we behave with kindness, when we behave with consideration for others, it's almost like we can talk about that as if it's a sort of an inevitable arising. So our potential, which is sort of encapsulated by the Buddha here on the shrine, so what we can become as human beings, and then actually what we can become even beyond the limit of what we know to be human, that is our potential, but it doesn't arise by itself. We have to plant the seeds, and then we have to do the work. So we have to create the conditions for something more positive to arise. And I was thinking about this over the last couple of weeks. I knew I was going to be speaking on this evening, and two examples came to mind for me. So strangely enough, as a Buddhist, I'm actually quite interested in gang culture. So I'm very, very interested in hip hop and that kind of music and the roots of that. And a lot of the roots of that was basically to do with gang culture. And I'm also quite interested in that as a kind of a phenomenon. In some ways, you could see some of the darker aspects of that as well, this thing that we talked about in terms of coming into relationship with what we can be as human beings. And I was thinking about two examples of documentaries that I've watched recently. One was an extremely positive example, and one was an extremely negative example. So I'll start off by talking about the negative example. So I was watching this mini documentary, it was only a couple of weeks ago, and it was about a gang in New York called the Crips. My partner and I always call them the Crisps, which brings a little chuckle to my mind, lightens things slightly. But anyway, so the Crips. So they're this gang in New York, and quite a fearsome reputation. And the documentary was about this young man, must have been about, I don't know, early 20s, 21, 22, something like that. And the documentary was about the lead up to, and basically then him joining this gang. So to join this gang, basically you have to go through an initiation ceremony. And the initiation ceremony is to be beaten up by a few different members of the gang. And watching this young man talking about why he wanted to join this gang, and then seeing what was going to happen at the initiation ceremony, and then seeing him afterwards, was, I think, one of the most tragic things I've ever seen in my life. It was one of the most tragic, painful, dark things I think I've ever seen. This young man was so deluded that he was convinced that basically his life would become much better if he was going to become a fully paid up member of this gang. So he said, things aren't going so well, and I can see that basically I'm going to have to become a sort of a full member of this gang. And the way he was talking was that basically these guys really, really loved him. They really, really cared about him. And then he had this initiation where he was beaten up really, really badly by these guys. And then afterwards he was talking about it in terms of how much they loved him and how much they cared for him. And he said, this has been a difficult day, but this is something that I'll remember for the rest of my life. And I just thought how unbelievably painful and difficult that was, and how difficult it was to watch. And you might now expect that I'm going to say, okay, but this thing happened, and there was a happy ending. But there's no happy ending. There just wasn't, basically. That was the end of the documentary, and this guy's going to carry on with his life, and who knows what's going to happen to him. I don't know, but I suspect that the outcome's not going to be good for him. I just thought it was really, really interesting from my perspective, seeing the effect of conditions on that young man's life, and knowing that actually it's possible that he could change his situation. And there are lots of examples of people having changed that kind of situation, but didn't seem to be the path that he was going on. So he was going down a very, very difficult, very dark path. And then I saw this other documentary about a year ago, which was incredible, and it's called Rubble Kings. And I do actually recommend watching this if you're able to. You can stream it online, and it's basically it's a feature-length documentary. The other one was a short one. It's a feature-length documentary about the gangs of New York in the late 70s and early 80s. And there was these gangs like the Savage Skulls, the Nomads, and these really, really fearsome gangs. And basically, what happened was there was an incident where a young man who was a peace envoy from one of the gangs went to visit one of the other gangs to have a discussion about possibly concluding a peace treaty, and they shot him in cold blood. So this was a really, really terrible thing to happen. And of course, that blew up in that community, basically. And the gang that he was part of were absolutely furious. So they were about to start this all-out war, basically. They said they wanted revenge, and they were going to create a lot of suffering in order to avenge his death, in inverted commas. And what happened was they went to see the mother of this young man. So they went to see his mum to say to him that we're going to avenge the death of your son. We're going to avenge the death of your child. And they went to see her, and they explained to her what had happened, and they said, "Don't worry, we're going to avenge his death. We're going to get even, basically, and his death wouldn't have been in vain." And it's really interesting. This old woman, who must have been in her late 60s, something like that, she just said to them, "You fools, you absolute fools. Like, do you really think that that's going to solve anything? I don't want any more bloodshed in my son's name. I don't want anybody to harm a hair on anybody else's head." And it's absolutely incredible. What then happened was they stopped and they thought about this and they reflected on their actions. They called a meeting. All the gangs of New York came together. This has been fictionalized in a film called The Warriors. I don't know if anybody's seen the film The Warriors. It's fictionalized in The Warriors, but it was true. And basically there was a truce between these gangs. And there was no more bloodshed for years and years and years. So that's one thing. And then another thing was that as a result of that, what happened was that hip-hop culture flourished. Because all of these gang members could start going to each other's territory and start going to parties and start meeting girls from other gangs, and they kind of ditched their denim and their gang uniform, started wearing tracksuits, started caring about the way that they looked, and it was incredible. They were on the cusp of all this violence and bloodshed, and this one woman's it was interesting. Maitreya Bandhu saying in the first half, talking about the words that we use and what we say. So this woman's speech at this particular time basically completely changed the course of history and saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. So we have this potential all the time, don't we, to behave in a way that either takes us towards our potential, takes us towards greater levels of openness, of beauty, of being in a position where we can come more into relationship with each other and make the world a better place for each other, or we can choose to do the opposite of that. And it's not a given, so we have to choose that. It was particularly poignant, I was thinking, with this documentary about this young man, because what he was moving towards was this initiation, and as Maitreya Bandhu was saying in the first half, and I've been thinking about this a fair bit as well, he was talking about his own ordination, which in a sense is also a form of initiation, but in completely the opposite kind of way. So it's an initiation into a new kind of life, but a life where you're committed to basically living out your potential. So you're committed to putting your Buddhist practice at the heart of everything that you do, and committed to a life where you are trying to refine what you do in order to to uncover and to deepen our own potential, basically. And in terms of what we've been talking about, so in terms of death, karma and wisdom, what we're trying to move towards in doing that, what we're trying to uncover is that wisdom aspect. But in a sense, we can move towards that, but all we can do is create the conditions for that something higher, that wisdom to arise. So we can't say, okay, I'll do A, B, C, D, and wisdom will arise, or our potential will arise. All we can do is create the conditions, and something magical starts to happen, something magical starts to arise. And I know for myself, my trail bandit was talking about why he was ordained, and he couldn't come up with a satisfactory answer. I know for myself why I wanted to be ordained, and why I made this commitment is because I know that I need a framework for that. So I think it ties in very, very importantly with commitment. So we're quite sort of fickle creatures in a sense, aren't we? There's a large part of us that just wants an easy life, or we just want pleasure, or we just want to do what is kind of easiest in the moment. That's part of our sort of natural human tendency, isn't it? And there's nothing wrong with that. And don't misunderstand me as well. I'm not saying that a life of commitment on the Buddhist path or following the Buddhist path is not without pleasure. But actually there's a much, much deeper pleasure that we can access if we live a life that is committed. And I think we need a context for that. So the context is not necessarily ordination, but it is a context of commitment in some sense. So whether that's committing to meditating every day, or whether it's committing to a particular ethical practice, or whether it's a commitment to just kindness, or whatever it is, I think we need a framework, and we need a sense of commitment to what we're doing as well. It's interesting that there's an image that came to mind, which is I don't know why, but I mean maybe it's just middle age. But over the last couple of years, I've started getting really interested in plants. I don't know. I'm just looking at the other middle-aged people here in the room and saying, "Is that?" Because I was like useless with plants when I was a younger man. I shouldn't admit this, but I remember once when I was a student, I had this plant and I used to feed it on bong water. So you know what people know what a bong is, where you smoke. Anyway, enough of that. And I used to feed this plant on bong water. And I used to think, wow, man, I'm going to have a stoned plant one day. I can tell you it doesn't work. And I just think, what was I doing, basically? But I couldn't make things grow, basically. I just couldn't make things grow. And people used to give me plants, and they would always die. They just always die. I just couldn't get them to grow. And it's interesting because my mum is like totally the opposite. She's like really, really green-fingered. Any plant she comes into contact with just flourishes. I was just completely the opposite. I had this sort of negative Midas touch with plants. That they would be given to me and the next day they'd just be like this. But lately, I've been getting really, really interested in plants. And I take great joy in growing plants. And I've started growing a lot of them. And they're doing really, really well. You probably can't all appreciate how significant that is for me, but it's really significant. So they're doing really, really well, and I just find it joyful. I find it like a little while back there was we weren't trying to propagate the plants. I've got this basically the kitchen, got this windowsill that gets a lot of sun, and all the plants are on the windowsill. And we weren't trying to propagate these plants, but these little shoots started coming up from these seeds, and it was like, wow, this is really great. So got really interested in plants, and got this particular plant. I don't know what it's called, but it kind of starts off flat. It looks like a little bit like a lotus, and with the right conditions, what it does is it sort of shoots up. It looks a bit like a palm tree with a sort of a lotus flower on top. It's really strange because it doesn't look like it's going to do that. It just looks like it's going to just sit there like a cactus or something. But it started growing. But it just basically didn't really know what to do once it had grown. So I'm going to get a bit interactive here. So it kind of grown, and it looked a bit like a sort of a ballerina for a little while. But then it just started kind of going like this, basically. And it was sort of like, ended up like, ugh, like this. And it was kind of flopping out the side of the plant pot. And I just thought, oh, this is such a shame. So I thought, okay, I obviously need something to support it. So what I did was, basically I got this little chopstick, and I put the chopstick in next to the plant and managed to fit it in the side of its leaves and basically just hold it up like that. And it's sorted it right out. It's fantastic. I don't know why I'm telling you this. No, actually I do. The reason why I mention this is that basically now you can take the chopstick out and it still stands there. But I think it's a good idea to have it in place for a while anyway. But it just made me think that we are a bit like that, aren't we? We need support, and we know what to do, but we need something to support us, and we need something that is going to kind of keep us straight and support us while we're growing. So we need the right conditions, and we need a context, and I think we need commitment as well. So what I'd like us to do is, I'm going to get us to go into pairs, and I want us to just think about this idea of commitment for a few minutes. And I'd like you to just think, what would it mean for you to commit more fully to something that you believe in? So is there something that you know is the right thing to do? I mean, I think we sort of know this, don't we? We have an intuitive grasp and an intuitive sense. I mean, I think this is why we know that there is more to life, and we know that there is meaning in life, because we have a sense, we just have an intuitive inbuilt human sense of what is valuable. And sometimes that sense needs to be refined, and it needs input from other people, and it needs to be explored and reflected on, but we know what's valuable. I was thinking about this. What I was going to do as part of this little section was I was going to read you out two different song lyrics or two different poems. So I really, really love pop culture, and I was going to start off with something really, really profound, and then I was going to read you the lyrics from Barbie Girl by Aqua. And see what you basically made of those two things. I'm not knocking Barbie Girl by Aqua. I mean, it's fantastic. It was a huge hit in India, sold millions of copies. But we know that it doesn't really have particular value, don't we? We know that. It's a bit like I was saying earlier at the start of the evening. It has that sort of souvenir-y quality to it. There's nothing valuable or deep about it, basically. When you compare that with something like, I don't know, a Rothko painting or something like that, somehow we know that there is something in that relates to something in us, which is about our potential, and it's about beauty. And we know that because something in it calls forth something in us. So there's something there of beauty that we respond to. So I think we have an intuitive sense of this. And we also know when we're living up to our potential, or we know when we're not living up to our potential. And often we know what we need to do. We know what the next step is in order to start to live out our potential more. So I'd like you to think about what would be something that you could commit to for the upcoming period. Something that you could commit to that would take you in the direction of deeper meaning, deeper value, and I'd like you to make a commitment to the person there. Just say what it is that you're going to do and commit to it. What would it be, and what will you do, and then commit to doing it. So it has to be something achievable. So it has to be something that you can see through. So something that is relatively, has enough, something that you can do but has enough challenge in it that you know that it's going to make a significant difference. Okay, so let's just get into pairs, and we'll do that for the next few minutes.